Imagine waking up one morning completely unaware that everything in your life is about to collapse, not slowly, not over weeks or months, but in a single devastating wave. Your children gone, your home destroyed, your wealth stolen or burned to the ground, your health shattered. And when you reach for comfort, the people who should stand beside you instead blame you. And worst of all, heaven feels silent. Would you still trust God? This isn't a hypothetical story. This is the life of a man named Job. Job lived in a place called Uz, and he wasn't just a good man. The Bible describes him as blameless and upright. He truly feared God, genuinely avoided evil, and lived with integrity. People respected him. His name carried weight. And he was incredibly wealthy. 7 sons, 3 daughters, and a massive estate with thousands of animals, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 oxen, and 500 donkeys. By every measure of his time, Job was the greatest man in the East. And then one day, something happened in the spiritual realm that Job knew nothing about. The angels gathered before God, and among them came Satan the accuser. God asked him, "Where have you been?" And Satan casually replied, "Just roaming the earth, observing." Then God said something extraordinary. "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him." You can almost hear the pride in God's voice, not pride in Job's wealth, but in Job's character. But Satan wasn't impressed. He shot back with a cold accusation. "Does Job fear God for nothing? You've blessed him. You've protected him. Of course he worships you. Take away his blessings, and he will curse you to your face." God responded, "Very well. Everything he has is in your hands, but do not lay a finger on him." And with that, the test began. One ordinary day, Job was at home when a servant came running, out of breath and terrified. "Master," he said, "the oxen and donkeys were out in the fields when the Sabaeans attacked. They killed the servants and stole the animals. I'm the only one who escaped." Before that servant even finished speaking, another one burst through the door, panicked, trembling. A fire from the sky, it fell on the sheep and the servants. "Everyone is dead. I'm the only one who escaped." Job didn't even have time to process it, because a third messenger rushed in and shouted, "3 raiding bands of Chaldeans attacked the camels. They killed the servants and took everything. I alone survived." And then the final blow. A 4th messenger, face pale, voice cracking, stepped forward and said the words no parent could ever bear. "Your sons and daughters were feasting at the oldest brother's house. A mighty wind came from the desert, struck the house, and it collapsed on them. All of them are gone. I alone escaped to tell you." In a matter of minutes, Job's entire world crumbled. His career, his wealth, his workers, his legacy, and worst of all, his children. Job tore his robe, a symbol of heartbreak. He shaved his head, a sign of deep mourning. But instead of cursing God, he fell to the ground and worshipped. He whispered words that became some of the most powerful lines in Scripture. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Despite unimaginable loss, Job didn't charge God with wrongdoing, and heaven watched. Sometime later, Satan appeared before God again. The same conversation began, "Where have you been roaming the earth?" And again, God pointed to Job. "He still maintains his integrity, even though you incited me against him without cause." But Satan wasn't finished. He replied, "Skin for skin. A man will give everything he owns for his life. Strike him, physically hurt his body, and he will curse you to your face." God answered, "Very well. Job is in your hands, but you must spare his life." Satan left, and Job's suffering entered a new level. Painful boils erupted all over his body, from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. Every inch of his skin burned, cracked, and oozed. He couldn't stand. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't walk without agony. The strongest, most respected man in the East was now physically broken and unrecognizable. Job left the city and sat at the ash heap, the garbage dump where people threw waste and burned refuse. He scraped his inflamed skin with a piece of broken pottery, desperately trying to ease the pain. And then came the most heartbreaking moment yet. His wife, also grieving the loss of all 10 children and the collapse of their home, looked at him, exhausted and devastated, and said, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." It wasn't cruelty, it was despair. She couldn't understand why God had allowed this. She couldn't bear seeing her husband suffer. In her eyes, death was mercy. But Job, despite trembling hands and shattered strength, replied gently, "You speak like someone who's lost perspective. Should we accept good from God and not also hardship?" And even in this agony, Job did not sin. Soon word spread that Job was suffering. His 3 closest friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, traveled from their homes to mourn with him. But when they saw him from a distance, they didn't even recognize him. This wasn't the man they once knew. This was a broken figure sitting in ashes, scraping his wounds. They wept. They tore their robes. They sprinkled dust on their heads. They didn't come with speeches or advice. They didn't preach at him. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sat beside Job in complete silence. No words, just presence, because his grief was too deep for explanations. But on the 7th day, Job finally spoke, and instead of crying for justice or asking for vengeance, he cursed the day he was born. He said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that announced a man is conceived." In other words, I wish I had never existed. I wish that day had been erased from the calendar. He asked, "Why didn't I die at birth?" Not because he wanted death, but because he longed for relief. Pain had swallowed every part of his being, and he didn't understand why God allowed it. That moment shattered the silence. His friends, thinking they were helping, began to speak not comfort, but accusation. Eliphaz started softly. Job listened. "No innocent person suffers like this. Maybe you did something wrong." Job shot back, "You're twisting my pain into proof of guilt. God knows my heart. Even if he crushes me, I will still hope in him." Bildad took it further. your children. Maybe they sinned. God is just. If you were truly blameless, He would restore you. Job snapped, "How dare you blame the dead? If God would just answer me, I would plead my case, but He is silent while I suffer." Then Zophar joined in Job. "Stop lying to yourself. God knows your wickedness. Beg for mercy before it's too late." And so began the longest argument in the entire book. Job insisting he had done nothing to deserve this. His friends insisting he must have. Each round grew more heated than the last. And yet, above the noise, above the storm of human accusations, God was listening as the arguments continued. Job's suffering didn't get lighter, it grew heavier. His friends insisted they were defending God, but their words only deepened Job's wounds. Instead of comforting him, they tried to explain his pain with a simple formula. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Therefore, in their minds, Job must have done something to deserve this. But Job knew that wasn't true. He knew his own heart, his integrity, his devotion. And so he continued defending himself, not out of arrogance, but out of desperation. He wanted answers. He wanted clarity. He wanted God to speak. At times, Job cried out in agony. At other times, he spoke with boldness, even frustration. He begged for a hearing with God, as if he were standing in a courtroom saying, "Let me speak to you directly. Let me plead my case." Days passed. The debates dragged on, and Job's emotions cycled through grief, anger, confusion, and longing. But underneath it all was something deeper. He still believed God was righteous. He just couldn't understand why this was happening. Then finally, after all the shouting, after the tears, after the accusations, after pages and pages of speeches, the storm broke. Literally, a whirlwind appeared, violent, powerful, impossible to ignore. And out of that storm, God finally spoke, but He didn't answer Job's why. Instead, God asked Job questions that shook him to the core. Who is this who darkens counsel without knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Job had wanted a conversation with God. Now he had one, but it was nothing like he imagined. God began painting pictures with His words, sweeping through the galaxies, the oceans, the mountains, and the deepest corners of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who stretched the measuring line across it? Have you ever commanded the morning to appear? Do you guide the stars? Can you loosen the belt of Orion? Job had no answers because these weren't questions requiring explanations. They were reminders. God continued, "Have you walked the depths of the sea? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Do you send lightning bolts on their paths?" Every question drew a line between the Creator and the created, between the one who governs the universe and the one who suffers within it. Then God shifted from the cosmos to the creatures of the earth, each one chosen with a purpose. He mentioned the lion. Do you hunt prey for the lion? The raven. Do you provide food for the ravens when their young cry out? Mountain goats giving birth on cliffs, wild donkeys running free across the desert. The ostrich, foolish yet fast, a creature with strange behavior only God understands. The war horse, powerful, fearless, snorting thunder before it charges into battle. The hawk, riding the wind, the eagle building its nest on the cliffs. Piece by piece, God was doing something deeper than answering Job's questions. He was reminding Job of something essential. My wisdom is far beyond yours. My perspective is infinitely higher than your pain. Nothing happening in your life is outside my sight or my power. But God wasn't done. He then introduced two mysterious and terrifying creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, symbols of untamable power. Behemoth, a massive, unstoppable creature with bones like bronze and muscles like cables. No human could control it. Leviathan, the great sea beast, fierce, fire-breathing in poetic imagery, untouchable, impossible to subdue. God asked, "Can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Who then is able to stand against me?" These weren't animals Job could tame. They represented chaos, danger, and forces no human could handle. But God could. And suddenly, Job realized something. He had tried to judge God's decisions with a human mind. He had tried to make sense of divine wisdom through the lens of human suffering. He had assumed silence meant indifference, when in reality, God's perspective was simply too vast, too complex, too eternal for Job to grasp. When God finished speaking, the storm quieted. And so did Job. He whispered, trembling, "I am nothing. What can I possibly say? I spoke once, but now I will speak no more." Job wasn't admitting guilt. He was recognizing the gap between his understanding and God's. He wasn't being crushed. He was being humbled. He wasn't being punished. He was being repositioned. Then Job spoke again, this time with transformed clarity. "I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be stopped. I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. I had heard about you before, but now I have seen you with my own eyes. I take back my words, and I repent in dust and ashes." This was the turning point. Job didn't get an explanation. He didn't get a timeline. He didn't learn the behind-the-scenes conversation between God and Satan. Instead, he got a revelation, an encounter with God himself. And that was enough. But the story doesn't end there. After God spoke to Job, he turned to Job's three friends, the ones who had spent days lecturing and accusing him. And God was not happy. He said to Eliphaz, "You and your two friends have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." Think about that. Job, the man who questioned, cried, complained and wrestled with his suffering, had spoken truthfully. The friends who tried to defend God by oversimplifying suffering had spoken falsely. Their mistake. They assumed pain was always punishment. They assumed suffering was a sign of sin. They assumed they understood God's justice perfectly, but they didn't. So God instructed them to offer a burnt sacrifice and then ask Job to pray for them, because Job's prayer would be accepted. The same man they judged was now the man who would intercede for them. And Job did. Then something beautiful happened. God restored Job not because of Job's righteousness, not because he passed the test, but because God is compassionate, generous, and faithful. Scripture says God gave Job twice as much as he had before. If he once had 7,000 sheep, now he had 14,000. If he once had 3,000 camels, now he had $6,000. His oxen doubled, his donkeys doubled, and more importantly, God blessed Job with 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. What's interesting is that Job's daughters are mentioned by a name which was rare in ancient texts and described as the most beautiful in the land. Job lived 140 more years. He saw his children and his grandchildren all the way to the 4th generation. And eventually, he died old and full of years. Now it's easy to read Job's restored fortune and think, good, everything worked out. But the message of Job is far deeper. It's not a simple formula, endure suffering, and God will make you wealthy. It's a reminder that God is still God, even when life breaks you. That faith isn't a transaction, it's a relationship. That your suffering isn't always punishment, that God's silence isn't abandonment, and that God's wisdom is bigger than human explanations. But there's another layer, one that reaches into our lives today. Just like Satan accused Job, the accuser still whispers to us, "You only love God because He blesses you. You're not good enough. You messed up. God won't forgive you. Your pain means God has abandoned you." But Scripture says we have an advocate, Jesus Christ, who defends us, not accuses us. When Satan points to your failures, Jesus points to the cross. When Satan says you're unworthy, Jesus says you're forgiven. Job's story doesn't promise an easy life. It doesn't pretend suffering is simple. It doesn't explain why bad things happen. Instead, it teaches us something far more powerful. Faith isn't tested when life is good. It's revealed when life falls apart. And even in the darkest moments, God is still working. Even when He seems silent, He is still present. And in His perfect timing, He restores, He heals, and He brings hope again. If you've made it this far into Job's story, you've probably noticed something important. This isn't just an ancient tale about a man who lost everything. It's a mirror reflecting the questions, the fears, and the struggles every human faces at some point in life. And part 3 is where we zoom out from the narrative itself and enter the deeper meaning behind it, the part that speaks directly to us. Because the book of Job isn't just about suffering. It's about the unseen world, the human heart, and the character of God. Let's start with something subtle but powerful. 1. Job never learns about Satan's challenge. Think about that. You and I, the readers, get to see the spiritual conversation at the beginning. We see Satan accusing. We see God permitting the test. We see the invisible battle behind Job's visible tragedy. But Job never sees any of it. He goes through loss, pain, humiliation, confusion, silence, all without understanding why. And that's the point. Sometimes in life, we suffer without answers, not because God is cruel, but because we live in a world where we don't see the whole picture. There are spiritual battles, purposes, and outcomes far beyond what we can understand. Job's story teaches us that faith isn't built on explanations. It's built on trust. When God finally speaks, He doesn't reveal the heavenly conversation. He doesn't explain Satan's accusation. He doesn't reveal the purpose of the suffering. Instead, God reveals Himself, and that changes everything. Job's friends are a warning for us. It's easy to criticize Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, but their mistake is one we often make. We rush to explain pain instead of sitting with people in it. The friends started well. They traveled long distances. They mourned with Job. They sat in silence for 7 days, an incredible act of compassion. But when they opened their mouths, everything fell apart. Why? Because they believed a simple formula. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. And since Job was suffering, he must have done something wrong. It sounds spiritual. It sounds logical. But it was wrong. God himself said they had misrepresented him. Their mistake wasn't their loyalty. It was their arrogance. They assumed they understood the mysteries of God. They assumed they could interpret someone else's suffering. And sometimes, without realizing it, we do the same. We try to fix people's pain. We try to explain tragedies. We try to make sense of things that only God understands. Job's friends remind us of this truth: compassion is better than explanation. Presence is better than theories. Humility is better than answers. Job's honesty wasn't rebellion, it was relationship. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of the story. Job cried out. He questioned. He lamented. He expressed anguish, confusion, and frustration. He even said things that were raw and uncomfortable. I wish I had never been born. Why won't God answer me? Why is this happening? But God never rebuked Job for his honesty. He rebuked the friends for their certainty. Here's why honesty is not the opposite of faith. Silence is. Job wasn't running from God. He was running to him. He kept the conversation alive. He brought his pain to the only one big enough to hold it. And that's what faith looks like in the real world. Not polished answers, but honest prayers. Not pretending everything is fine, but trusting God with the truth of our hearts. In fact, God said Job had spoken rightly. Job's honesty was an act of intimacy, the cry of someone who still believed God was listening. 4. God's questions were not meant to crush Job, they were meant to comfort him. At first glance, God's speech from the whirlwind can seem intimidating. Where were you when I created the earth? Do you command the morning? Can you tame Leviathan? But these questions weren't there to shame Job. They were there to shift his perspective. When life becomes painful, our world shrinks. We focus on our wounds. We focus on our confusion. We focus on what we've lost. God's questions expanded Job's view. He lifted Job's eyes from his pain to the stars, from the ashes to the mountains, from the silence to the vastness of creation. God wasn't saying you're insignificant. He was saying your suffering is not the whole story. You are held by a God who commands galaxies. You are loved by a God who feeds the ravens. You are seen by a God who watches every mountain goat give birth. And if God manages the universe with such precision, then surely he has not lost track of Job's life or yours. Job's restoration wasn't a reward. This is crucial. God didn't restore Job because Job earned it. He didn't restore Job because Job was patient. He didn't restore Job because Job passed the test. Restoration came because God is compassionate, God is generous, and God is faithful to his nature. But Job's restoration doesn't erase the suffering he endured. His new children didn't replace the ones he lost. Their memory remained. His new wealth didn't erase the trauma or the days he spent scraping himself in ashes. Restoration isn't the same as reversal. God didn't turn back time. He built something new, and sometimes God does the same with us. He doesn't always reverse the pain. He doesn't always undo the losses, but he brings new meaning, new healing, and new hope in ways we couldn't imagine. The story of Job points to something greater, someone greater. Job is considered one of the oldest stories in the Bible, possibly older than Abraham. And yet at the heart of Job's story is a universal question. Who will speak for me? Who will defend me? Who will stand between my suffering and God? Job longed for an advocate, someone who could plead his case. Thousands of years later, that advocate appeared. Jesus Christ. When Satan accuses, Jesus defends. When guilt whispers, grace speaks louder. When suffering comes, Jesus walks with us. When death threatens, Jesus conquers it. Job had no idea his cries would echo forward to the one who would one day stand in the gap for humanity. The story ends not with answers, but with a relationship restored. Job never gets the why. He never learns about Satan's challenge. He never hears the explanation for his losses. But he gets something far greater, an encounter with God himself, not the God of theory, not the God of tradition, but the God of presence. And that presence was enough. In the end, Job's story teaches us this. You may not always understand God's plan, but you can always trust God's heart. Because even when life collapses, even when prayers seem unanswered, even when grief feels unbearable, God is still working in ways you cannot see. And in His time, not ours, He restores, He heals, He strengthens, and He brings light back into the places that once felt hopeless. Job's journey is a reminder that faith is not built on clarity. Faith is built on trust. And the God who created the universe is the same God who holds you in your darkest hour.